Our guest today on the Strong Women podcast is Faye Rudkin, and we're so pleased to have her with us today. So when Faye was 3 years old, she went profoundly deaf. And through much struggle, she's been able to use this pain in her story to bring healing not only to her own life, but also to the lives of countless others. When she was 18, she founded Aid the Silent, which is an organization in Texas, a nonprofit organization in Texas that helps deaf and hard of hearing children get the support that they need. In 2018, she was named San Antonio's Woman of the Year by the San Antonio Journal, and she was also appointed by Governor Abbott to serve on the Texas Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities, which she did until 2020. And we're just so thrilled to hear Faye's story, and we know you guys are going to be encouraged by it too. So Faye, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much. As long as I can see your faces, I'm going to be good for the rest of the interview.
Okay, great.
Yeah, when we heard about your story, Faye, we thought, well, she's deaf, so how can we share her story on the podcast? But you are really remarkable in your ability you're looking at our faces. And if you're listening to this podcast, you might want to hop on our YouTube channel and watch the recording and you'll get to see Faye's beautiful face. And but she's reading our lips right now, and that's how she's able to talk to us. So an incredible person, and I can't wait to hear your story and share it with our listeners. But I want to start with your name, Faye, because that is very Southern. So are you a Southern girl?
Yes, I'm from South Texas, and my family name is Faye, so Emma Faye, and my name has a significant meaning as an adult, and at first I didn't know what it meant, but I'll share my story more. But in my greatest trial of my life, I felt the Lord telling me, look up the meaning of your name. And when I looked it up, it meant whole and complete, and Faye meant whole and complete trust. So my name means whole and complete trust, and that's exactly what I've had to come before Jesus for all the time, is having whole and complete trust in His plan and beauty in my life.
Wow, that's beautiful. I love that.
Beautiful. Yeah. Okay, so tell us about your home growing up. So you grew up in the South and in Texas, you said. But you had most of us don't have significant events quite so early in our lives, but you did at 3 years old. But maybe you can just describe your family a little bit and then tell us what happened when you were 3 years old.
I was actually born on a ranch in Texas, so grew up around animals, had a really beautiful childhood. And my family, when they found out I was profoundly deaf, the very first person they had ever known who was deaf was their own child. So it rocked my family's world. They weren't familiar with deaf community. This is before really the internet, and you couldn't find a community online, other people that had the same experiences and struggle. And the faith aspect was my family at this point had gone to church, a Christian home, but because of being deaf, I was very naive to everything around me. So I would go to church, but you would just sit there in silence, really, and I would be so lost and confused. And I actually attended a private Christian school here. Barely got into the school because I was so behind on reading comprehension and speech, understanding, just my ability to understand and process and have communication was very lacking around the time I went to this private school. But they believed that they saw something in me, that we could figure this out together. And so I was the first and really only deaf person that went to that private school all the way through. So God to me was that I believed he made me, but I felt like he was so detached from me. Because why was I deaf? What if God really loved me? Why could I not hear around me? And especially being in a Christian community and assuming that I wasn't included, I didn't belong. So that sent the message to me early on that I don't belong to the people of God. And I believe he's real, but he just didn't love me enough to give me the ability to hear. And he didn't love me enough to give me people that seemed to care. And of course that changed later. God really rescued me from a lot of darkness. But early on, I would say he didn't love me, he didn't know me, and I was just trapped in a very silent and quiet world.
You said that changed later on. Was there an event that sparked a relationship with God for you, or did it just kind of over time as you matured? Can you tell us about that?
There was definitely a moment, an event for me. And I know God was working on my heart for years. And I now, a bunch of amazing therapists in my life and doctors told me that I probably was experiencing major depression around the age of 10, being majorly depressed and just complete silence. And I felt like I was always behind in school and friendships. And there's a quote by Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf. If you're familiar with Helen Keller's story, Helen Keller said in an interview, which is worse, to be blind or deaf? And she said, blindness separates me from the material, from things, but deafness separates me from the relational, from people. And so that was the cry of my heart at the time that Jesus met me, and that I was about 14 years old, and I decided to face my greatest fear, which was to attend a summer camp and to actually have to be alone without knowing anybody, just go to this camp. And I ended up understanding for the first time that I was wonderfully made and I had great purpose, and the God of the universe loved me and wanted to know me. But more importantly, I learned that my deepest pain was going to be launch pad for my greatest calling. That God was going to take something that the world would say and look at me, Emma's ears are broken. Her story is broken. She's not fully, and sadly the world would say I'm not normal enough. Well, thankfully I don't want to be normal, but God can use that for launch pad for my calling. And so I trusted from 14 years old, and just realizing I have a very unique privilege because I am deaf. I can cut out the world noise and just be with Jesus in that secret space, just him and I. I don't have to listen to the world noise. I can cut it out. I was protected from so many things, I believe, because I couldn't hear. And now that is my place where I can escape with God in the silence. Because that's what, a lot of times, that's where unique revelation comes from the Lord, is just being still and being able to block out things and just be with him. So that was the big realization at 14. And because of that, I started to dream crazy dreams with God of, I know I was made, wonderfully made, so what is next for me? And he started to reveal exactly what my life could hold, and I'm living that out now.
That quote you said about Helen Keller and that relational break-off, that relational barrier, I had never thought of that before. And I'm wondering, as I'm hearing you talk and how the quietness has gotten you to be closer to the Lord, but that must have caused so many, especially when you were young, so many difficulties relationally. And I imagine even with your parents, because you, as you said, they had never known anyone who was deaf until you came along. And you weren't born deaf, is that right? It was because of a fever that you had when you were 3 years old?
It was because of a fever. It was
Yeah.
later. So as a young child, no signs of hearing loss, but something happened around 3 years old, and they really don't know, to be honest, what happened. But that was before a lot of medical and technological advancements for hearing loss, and that they believe that's when it happened. So I actually remember certain songs before I went deaf. And I have
Really?
a recollection, like a memory of music way in the back of my mind. But I remember what it sounded like, for sure. But yes, it was not my early childhood.
Yeah. Well, I wondered about that, what memories you had, because so often we don't have memories going back before we're 3 years old. And so I was curious about that. How did your parents, now that you're older and have talked to your parents about this, I'm sure many times, what was their perspective, or what was their, as you're struggling as a child, and like you said, by 10 in a deep depression, I can't imagine what your parents were going through.
They're tough. Yes, my mother, there was no option to ever use hearing loss as a reason why I could not. And faith was a part of their story for sure, but I would say as we've gotten older, our faith has become a common ground. But my mother would say something. I went through a period of time, probably from 3rd grade until 8th grade. I would cry almost every single day. And she would pray, please let me pick her up. And she actually is not crying for the first day. Because something would happen with a friend, or I would fail a test. The teacher would say something and I would misunderstand. I would think I'm not invited to a party. I didn't hear. And then I'd find out I was invited to that slumber party or something. So every day it was something. So my mother would let me cry. We would come home, and she would sit on the bed with me, and she would say, Emma, you learned early on life is not fair. And I'm so sad for you that you were 3 years old and found this out. And tonight you are allowed to be sad. You're allowed to have a pity party. But then tomorrow, you're going to pick yourself back up and keep loving people. And that to me was so strange. Why am I loving the very people who are hating me? And my mother we said that over and over. You're going to pick back up, carry on, and love people. And choose joy. And as a young girl thinking, that is so not possible. And now that is the anthem of my life, to choose joy and suffering and sickness. And even in college, I ended up getting sick again and lost more of my hearing. And that was one of the darkest times in my life, but without fail, the darkest times have always been, that's that tension where you actually see the miracle. When you're in that time where you think, I am myself. As Emma Faye, I cannot do this. I can't get up and face a day. I mean, it was such a dark time. I could hardly get out of bed. I could hardly eat. Because I was grieving the fact that my only hearing was disappearing during that time. And just was totally comforted by the peace of God. And I was brought into healing with, therapy and doctors, and I had so much support that when I lost more of my hearing. But really it had to come down to Jesus' work in my heart.
What a sweet and wise mama. Just that advice, like, to allow you to mourn and grieve, and then say, okay, now let's face another day together. And I think that's really challenging. And I just think your mom must have been one strong lady too, because thinking about, we want to take our children's struggle from them, or at least I do. I want to take it from them. I don't want it to, I want to like say the right thing so it eases all that struggle. But what your mom demonstrated is that she didn't take the struggle from you. Of course she couldn't. Probably she knew early on she can't take that struggle from you. But she chose to be there as someone you could turn to in the struggle and walk alongside with you. I just have huge respect for her, and I want to learn from that lesson of the story you just told us. You've put in a lot of hard work to be able to communicate well, and to be able to even be on this podcast with us where you're reading our lips and we're not really slowing down our talk. You're just like in there. So I just am so curious. Tell us about the hard work. Tell us about it. What did you do?
Yes. There's no option to sit out on any of this, for sure, with my mom. So from the moment they found out I could not hear, I was placed in intensive speech, where I learned to speak by feeling vibrations from the therapist's mouth and putting my hand on her throat in front of her face to feel the way she was speaking. And that was 10 years. And hearing aids are computers, so they don't amplify sound, they fill in missing sounds. And my hearing loss is higher frequency loss. As an adult, I lost a lot of my low frequencies as well, but early on I could hear a little bit of low tones. But if you think about the alphabet in terms of sound, I can't hear most of the alphabet because it's higher frequency sounds. So what hearing aids do, they're not like glasses. They don't restore a perfect 20/20 vision if you wear them. They just boost you to a level of being able to decipher something. So it helps bring it up to a frequency that I may be able to understand. And it over enunciates the sound that I can't hear to help fill in the gaps for speech and environmental sounds. So that's why my speech is different. Is because I've only known a computer sound. And my speech was the thing that I was made fun of the most for. It was pointed out the most. It's something that I still struggle with every day. People will stop me and ask me about my voice. So I can't hardly speak without being stopped. And for example, I couldn't say a lot of words. I had no idea how to say 3 words that my mother says is the most expensive 3 words of her life. Was hamburger, computer, and napkin. Couldn't say those 3 words until I was about 11 years old.
So they were
Imagine
expensive.
being a preteen.
They were expensive to your mom because she had to work so hard at helping you learn to say them.
Yes. Yeah, we had to put, nothing is cheap when you're deaf. It's hearing aid, speech, everything. So my mother had to my father and my mother was financing everything. So that's why I do what I do today, for sure. But with speech, just imagine you're a preteen girl, a teenager, and you cannot say a lot of words, or you get made fun of. So I was having to constantly self-monitor myself, which makes me extremely self-conscious as a young girl. But I could hardly speak. My voice didn't matter because I was so embarrassed about it. And people would point out my hearing aids. I would have to present in front of my school or something in my class, and it would be horrifying because I would be made fun of for that. And now that's my job, is being a speaker. So it's really funny how God works, because you could not have paid me to speak before, and now that's what I do.
So all of your education has been in regular educational facilities. It hasn't been at a deaf school. And I'm listening to what you're saying and knowing that you've talked about struggling in school when you were young. But then I'm looking at your bio, knowing about you, that you graduated from the University of Texas Honors College cum laude, and that you're a speaker that speaks around the country. And all that you're saying right now, I'm just like, so you were able to overcome this depression and these struggles, and your parents didn't pull you out and decide, which of course sometimes, parents can make different decisions about that, but it's you graduated cum laude from college, and I'm just
eventually. So yes, it wasn't early on. Well, once I got to college, I had full access to a public university setting where they had everything I could use to understand. So I went from constantly trying to lip read, understand, barely hanging on, and then I went to the University of Texas, San Antonio, and ended up being top 5 at the university because I was like, wow, I can actually understand. And my whole life I thought I was not smart enough, I couldn't do it. And then once I actually understood, all of a sudden became top 5 honors college at, the second largest university in Texas right now. So it's just God has a sense of humor for sure. Mm-hmm. I remember being so upset I was such a bad student, and then I didn't even care when I got to college. I was like, okay, great, I'm busy. Yeah. I want to get out of here anyway to do my nonprofit. So it was just kind of a funny twist to my story for sure.
You say, of course I do have a disability, right, with your hearing loss. But you said really it's a different ability. Will you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean by that?
Yes. And it truly is my faith. So just so you all know, most of the deaf community is so far from God. Completely far. Only 2% have an active relationship with the Lord. And they are, as a people group, the deaf are the 3rd largest unreached. So sadly, a lot of the community with hearing loss and people with disabilities have no access to the church, or they've been so hurt by the church and so not included that they want nothing to do with God. So I always say disability, entry, and ability. That's because I really believe in that verse that says, in my weakness, like his strength is made perfect. And a disability is a part of who I am. I serve on a disability committee. I'm not afraid of that word. But my life is so rich and so full because I cannot hear. I am complete and I'm lacking in nothing because I'm actually missing a sense and a created struggle. And I would say God wants to use the weakest parts of our story, our sicknesses, struggles, anything that seems like it was meant for evil at one point, God will use for good. So it is a unique perspective of being a deaf Christian because I'm able to look at it and go, wow, this has just made me who I am, but it doesn't define me.
Wow, I did not know that about the deaf community and being an unreached group. And as you're saying that, my heart just breaks, and I can't help but think how the past 2 years as we've gone through COVID and everyone's been wearing masks, and I know you've gotten involved with that, but even with what you've done with, has the world for the deaf community really been closed off in a way that most of us, that has not been a part of the conversation. We're learning now that masks have been harmful to children in ways that we didn't understand. But I know you've talked about COVID and how has the mask brought maybe even more pain to the deaf community that we haven't even thought about.
Yeah, there was already a hurt there. There was already lack of access and accessibility. So adding this mask for the last 2 years, it's completely dehumanized me. I went from fighting my whole life for equal rights and access and understanding just to be able to order for myself at the grocery store and go to a restaurant by myself or a coffee shop well, all of a sudden, I have to have a caretaker. And I went from being a completely independent woman who was able to lip read and get along with my life as best as I could, and then now I have to bring a family member, and even having to fight doctors that no, I can't have one person with me. I can't just be alone. I have to have someone with me to help me, because I can't understand the front desk people. I don't know what the doctor is saying to me. So it's just been a very difficult time, especially for the children of the deaf community, because when everything went online, nothing was accessible. All of us were having to fight for, and when I say fight, I mean advocate. I always say, like, I'm a fighting spirit, but I mean advocating,
Right.
not actually
Yes,
fighting
we
people.
understand.
Yes, so you get me. But I have
Yes.
to clarify that sometimes, because people are like, why are you fighting people? I'm like, no, it's a good fight. It's the worthy fight. It's helping people, you know?
Yes.
So it's just a different kind of fight. But fighting for just understanding for school, it's just been so wild. But I do have a perfect platform in the state of Texas, and I've had chances to publish. It's a very secular, worldly magazine, but I actually did an interview with Cosmo about this. And it's like, thank you for the opportunity to be able to share this, because it was really bad in the beginning. People were so afraid to even write back and forth on a phone with me, or write things on a notepad, because they didn't want to touch anything and they didn't know much then. But the reason that started for me personally is I actually got basically kicked out of a gym, because I was like, hey, I can't understand you. Can you step back 6 feet and pull your mask down for just a few minutes? And the person was like, I guess really, really afraid. And I got kicked out and just really mistreated on that experience. And so that story is what went viral, was just people not being willing to even care about people with disabilities. And even we did a poll and a statistics in Texas that said more than 80% of people with disabilities in Texas felt like they were neglected critical health care because of people not going back to work, just not being willing to do in-home health care. So people have died and suffered because there's a real lack of compassion right now, and people aren't unified. So it's really caused minorities, especially disabilities, to really suffer.
At 14 is when you realize, like, oh, I am made on purpose with a purpose. Now, fast forward just a few years, 4 years, and you actually launch your own organization. And you were just talking about the mask, all the mask stuff, and some of your advocating things that you're involved in. So I want you to talk about Aid the Silent that you started, and what, tell us that aha moment for you. I mean, you're sitting in the living room and you're like, hey, I'll just start an organization. Or what? How did that all come about?
So the more I fell in love with Jesus and saw how my own story ended up so different than most children with hearing loss, it ended up having, I had resources and access, and it really made me look back and think, I'm leaving all these children behind. Like, I have to go back for them. So the more that God called me to freedom in my own life, the more I could not ignore that there's generations of children and adults who were completely lost, and no one is doing anything about it. Thankfully, there's more people now, but early on, the statistics when I started this ministry, only 300 people were in the world working towards deaf ministry and the gospel for the deaf, for the third largest unreached group of people. So I was like, I have to be 301. This is happening. And basically, I had a journal around 16 years old, actually. And just, my father actually is a court-appointed attorney for children and CPS cases. And he had a deaf child one day. And we all talked about it as a family. and he just had no one that played for him and fought for him. And my father was just telling me about his story and experience of being a deaf child on foster care, and that is a whole nother battle and experience, another layer of just trauma. And I felt like God at a young age was speaking to me that I was one day gonna face these issues and do something about it. And so I started writing down on a journal different names of what I would call it. And the first name we have is actually Aiding San Antonio, like a hearing aid, Aiding San Antonio. And I felt the Spirit of God say, don't limit yourself to San Antonio. So the name became Aid the Silent. And the name is from where does my help, where does my aid come from, and just the belief that God gives voice to the voiceless, and children are the most vulnerable group of people, particularly deaf children are extremely vulnerable. They feel like their voices don't matter. So aiding, physically providing, hearing aids and resources, but there's something deeper and spiritual about what we're doing behind just giving hearing aids, and that's where the name came from. And 16 years old, so God can use you when you're very young. I had that dream. And then I also was learning to play music at the same time. And music became a huge part of my story as someone deaf because, first of all, everyone told me I could never learn to play. They were asking me not to attend music theory classes because I was too deaf to do it. And, of course, I was like, well, you told me I could not, so guess what? That's the very thing I'm going to do.
And guess what? Beethoven was deaf too, right?
Yes, Beethoven was deaf, yeah. So I was like, this is possible, and my little feisty spirit is like, just watch me. God has something bigger, don't question me. So, I ended up learning music because my only role model growing up was actually a Miss America. Miss America was the first one who was deaf, was Heather Whitestone in 1995, and she was a ballet dancer. So I was like, I'm going to play music and compete at Miss America. So that was the biggest dream I had, was I'm going to start a nonprofit and do Miss America. And of course, you just like, how is that even possible? Not possible, but at 18, I ended up getting a random email from Miss America saying I was signed up for Miss San Antonio, the official preliminary, and I played guitar, sang, and then I knew you had to have a platform for Miss America, and typically you would find a nonprofit or find a cause and create a program for school. And for me, I was like, well, it's time to start Aid the Silent. It's been a dream of mine, and in about 2 or 3 months, most schools take forever to get ready for pageants. In about 2 or 3 months, I signed up, started a nonprofit, and won Miss San Antonio, became the first one who was deaf, and God took it off from there. And it's been a miracle since I was 18 years old.
I knew that part about your story, that you had done beauty pageants, but I didn't know why or how you had gotten into that. So that part of the story is amazing too. That and the music piece. Yeah, well, just yes. This inspiration of Miss America in 1995, and then that you were inspired to play music. But so tell everybody, share with everybody what music you play.
I started with piano because of Beethoven, and I would feel the music and visually learn it. And music feels so different on different notes. So I would learn the frequencies of certain sounds and chords, and I would practice actually turning off my hearing aids, and I would start practicing at like 11 o'clock at night. Much to my family's, they were not super thrilled about that. But I was practicing just closing my eyes. I would put my head against the upright piano and just learn to feel it through music. And then that led into guitar and through singing. From years of speech, which I hated. Years of speech therapy, I believe, taught me the placement of your mouth produces sounds and certain frequencies. So I would actually sing into the corner of my bathroom, because that was where the frequencies were the strongest. And that ended up becoming a huge part of my story, was music and feeling music. It just got me in the door. But of course, hard work cut me there. But it's what made Abe the Silent known. So honestly, the platform was why I ever did it. Was the platform, you know, in the world's eye, I had a crown. So I was like, oh, shiny object. Let me see who this person is and listen. And then my faith, my story is what cut me there. And the organization has been a beautiful journey. I mean, the organization within its first year became internationally known because I was given money. So basically, I was forced advertising for a long time. I was like, I'm gonna give hearing aids for kids, summer camp, ASL lessons, speech therapy, all these different things, and I had no money, no connections, did not know a deaf child.
You're speaking in faith.
So I put the cart way before the horse, just in total faith that this was gonna happen. And I had one donor come and give me $5,000. Now, hearing aids cost about $5,000, so that would give me what? One kid could get one resource, and that would have been the end of the story. Well, I'm thinking, God, how do I multiply this little that I have been given? Just $5,000. What do I do with this? I couldn't do much. And I took that $5,000 and created this campaign, actually. And as Miss San Antonio, I was getting all of these messages and emails and letters from kids just like me, saying their struggles about being deaf and their experiences, and how seeing my story and seeing my hearing aids, because you could see my hearing aids in all my pictures and videos. I was wearing my hair up for them so that like the kids could see them. And they would write me these messages about embracing who they were and accepting this part of their story. So I came up with a marketing campaign called #ShowYourAids, your hearing aids. And I had that $5,000, and I posted, if you post a picture of your hearing aids or cochlear implant, and you post, you know, your story and experience, the donor will give $5 per post up to $5,000. So I made it it looked like a matching campaign. And at first, no one was doing that. I was like, wow, I'm already failing at this. This is an epic fail. And about 3 weeks into this campaign, it started to be picked up all over the United States, and people were sharing their hearing aids and using that hashtag, which meant what? Overnight exposure for Abe the Silent, a tiny baby nonprofit in Texas.
With big promises.
And San Antonio.
With big promises.
Big promises. So, over-promising, for sure. And it ended up going all over the United States, this movement. And then we started noticing it was popping up in different languages. So it was all over South America. It was in Israel, the UK, Germany, Australia, the Netherlands. So Abe the Silent went from no one knowing about it to an internationally known organization overnight. And from there, we have just seen miracle after miracle and provision after provision. And even in the very beginning, I actually was only the spokesperson and the founder. So I would just fundraise for it and talk about it. Well, about 3 years ago now, I actually am the executive director of it. So I wasn't really running it myself for a long time because I was finishing school and speaking and doing beauty pageants. And then now I actually oversee the programs and everything. But basically, we provide any sort of resource a deaf child needs. We provide resources all over the United States and beyond, but mainly, of course, focused in Texas because that's where we are. And we started doing something called hearing aid clinics, where we would travel and set up volunteer doctors and help children who cannot afford these devices, insurance not covering it. And we will see about 20 kids in a day. And for a process that can take about a year for Medicaid and coverage and a bunch of different doctors you have to go to for clearance, we were getting it done in a week, about 2 weeks. So really changed how to service children. And we also partner with an amazing organization, Young Life, a camping organization, very relational. And so we are the pilot program for Deaf Young Life. So we have been planting different Deaf Young Lives, and we have the pilot program here in San Antonio. So lots of children have followed Jesus and decided to follow him because of what God did. And we are now 7 years old, and just year after year have seen provision for finances, for kids, and the moment you think, I cannot do this anymore, this is too much, it's very emotional what we do. Because we do have children in foster care. A lot of children, pretty much all of them, have some sort of trauma and horrific stories. And just to see God work in their own little hearts and lives. And we service anywhere from birth, so the moment they find out they're deaf at birth maybe, and then all the way to high school graduation.
Well, I love your creativity, and it's so awesome to hear the story of how you started, because it wasn't without struggle. It's not like you had this idea and it was just an easy road. And I just couldn't help but laugh when you started the hashtag thing in 3 weeks, nothing happens.
Yes.
And so many of us would give up, and you didn't give up. And your perseverance and even your courage, Emma Faye, in reaching kids who have so much trauma and brokenness. And I cannot imagine the emotional weight of going into these stories and these children's lives.
True.
And so I love, I would actually love I don't know if you have a specific story that you could share with us, but you keep mentioning the miracles of God. And I would love to, if you could even be specific and share a story with us.
We have a refugee community here, and we heard about this child, and this is right when COVID happened. Right when it happened, and we had just ordered these amazing hearing aids, but they were stuck inside the school because everything closed down right when this kid was about to get a hearing aid. So we're thinking, this poor child is now trying to do online school with no hearing aid, and he is a hearing aid user, he has to have them to understand, and they are stuck inside the school building. And his teachers couldn't get it. It was just taking forever. So finally, someone was able to get into the school and basically kidnap the hearing aid back. And we're thinking, okay, now what? We don't have any equipment we need to fit this kid and program this device. So lots of people came together, and we retrofitted. I have a van for Aid the Silent, and we retrofitted this van to be able to test and fit this device. And so we were in his front lawn. So normally this isn't a medical office or a doctor's office, but we were in his front yard, and we had arranged for his entire school to drive by his house after he got his hearing aids. Oh. So they had a hearing aid parade. All his teachers, principal, friends, they started driving through the neighborhood after we fit the hearing aid. None of his family can speak English. So we had to find this particular language. It's very difficult, as no one really speaks it, but a neighbor of someone spoke this language. So we're on the front yard, and while I'm standing there, another child found out that I was there from a different part of the town, and he comes over and hands me a broken hearing aid. I'm like, I can't fix this with glue or something. No, that doesn't work that way. But that was the realization of, okay, this was so big. Like, it was so scary that this kid heard I was down the street or something and handed me his hearing aid, and his grandmother and his whole family drove and somehow got transportation to find me. And so I ended up going into the family's home at some point and getting the hearing aid and fixing it and all this stuff. But that kind of planted the vision of, we're going to have to go to them. Because we often, as believers, will set something up and we're like, okay, they got to come to us. We have this awesome church. We have this awesome program. Hopefully they come. Jesus never did that. He didn't set up a shop and say, come to me. Like, he literally went out and saw people and lived among the broken people. And so when we do these clinics and when we work with these families, you have to go to them. Like, stop waiting for them to come to you. And we do live in that gritty spot of ministry with people. Is not easy. It's hard. People are very broken and a lot of times in their darkest, most desperate situations. So it's learning. I've learned so much of how to interact with people who are literally just surviving. They're just trying to put food on the table. Here and there don't matter. They're like the last resort of priorities. And just to see providing just a basic necessity of communication, whether that's language. So we also just do sign language. We do only speech. We do summer camp. So any type of resource that we provide, it's a complete avenue for the gospel. Because I always think of that verse in James, and it talks about when your brother's in need, and you say, oh, I pray you get clothing, I pray you get food. No. You provide that food. You help clothe your brother. And that, for me, was so important. You get sick of seeing people just being surface Christians. You get tired of it. It's hard for me to go to church sometimes because I'm like, okay, we're doing a lot of talk, but please get into the game. Because we're living in a time in history where it's time to get in the game. You don't get to sit on the sides, be on the bleachers of church. Church is only meant to be a gathering place to send you out. It's supposed to be a touchstone place to get ready for ministry and life for the week. But so often, a lot of us are just Sunday Christians. We just go to Sunday, to church, and then we leave. And so I would say that's the biggest thing I've learned through doing hardcore, boots on the ground ministry is it's not just sitting, waiting. You do have to go and tell them. How can I know unless we tell them, right? So it's the same concept.
Well, I'm really glad that you shared all of that, and I hope our listeners will be encouraged to look up your website, your organization, and we will link to the website in our show notes. So check it out and see what Emma Faye's up to. Sounds like a lot, Emma Faye. But before we let you go, we have just a couple more questions. I'm wondering, I know you work with kids and a lot of young people. If you have advice, and actually I think a lot of the things that you've said throughout our time together today are advice for young people, but let's just take a minute to just be real specific about young people. Do you have advice for the young listeners?
I've noticed a trend of just, I hate to say it, but it is victimhood. And it's this era of self-love and self-worth and my self-esteem. The moment, like I had a friend recently left because it was time for self-love and self-worth and finding herself. I'm going, what are you looking for? Like, looking for yourself and taking care of your own self. Of course, there's a proper time for boundaries, rest, all those things. But there's never a time where we just go, you know what, I'm out. These people are difficult. This is hard. You know, being a follower of Jesus is hard. I'm just going to love myself and do my own thing. The Bible never says that. Like, there's no such thing. It says love your neighbor as yourself, meaning to think less of yourself, think more of your neighbor. Because we as people are so self-absorbed. It's just a nature. So I've seen this so much, especially with young women. When something tragic happens, I understand. Trauma happened, real things happen that are horrible, and I get it. But there is a point where you do have to come to Jesus with it and say, you know what? This isn't the defining moment. God's gonna use this for good. But if you keep living in that hurt, you can't live in that hurt. You have to make your home somewhere else. But I just see that so much of young people just constantly reliving and rehashing. And if you're to the point you've spent like several years in therapy with the same therapist and you're not making progress, go somewhere else. Like, do something that you're not just reliving and rehashing the same exact thing. Really try to not dwell there. And if I woke up and was like, oh my gosh, every day I'm deaf, I was not treated well as a child, I experienced whatever. If I kept replaying that in my mind over and over, I would never move on. I would never become what God asked me to be. And there's a time to take deep healing, and I had to do that. I took about 6 months of just needing to heal and deal with trauma and go to therapy and take time off and all that. And once I did that, it's just been, I can't slow down now because I truly wanted to heal. And God had to have me face it for what it was. I couldn't ignore it. But then there was a time of, I'm not going to keep bringing this back up. I need to heal, move on. But that's what breaks my heart when people choose not to be free. Because Jesus is helping you step out and be free. And so many people will be like, okay, God, I saw that you broke open the jail. Like, grace is here, I can be saved. But then they keep sitting in that same situation, that same mindset of, wow, I'm so sad for me. Of course, it's okay, but like my mom had that amazing advice. Be sad for a moment. Allow yourself to feel it. Don't ignore it. And then move on. Get up and love people. Because the moment we actually aren't about our own lives and our own struggles, we start to see that God created us to love people. And the moment that I'm all about myself, I'm going to lose who I really am. I'm finding myself because I'm laying down my life for other people. And Jim Elliot said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And I've lived a lot of that in my life just to see it's worth it. It's worth doing what's hard, and it's worth not living and being a victim to what's happened to you.
That is so powerful coming from you, Emma Faye. Honestly, that is just so powerful. And because it's true and because you're living that. And that's, I think, why it's just so powerful to hear that coming from you. So thank you for that. It was for young women in mind, but this middle-aged woman is really convicted by all that you're saying. I can tell you're referencing Helen Keller and Jim Elliot, and so I have a feeling you've read some books in your life, and we love to talk about books.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering if you would share with us some books that have just been so meaningful for you in your life.
One of them was actually Bob Goff. He had a book called Love Does. And that was the first time I realized it's okay to be joyful and colorful and live out a crazy journey with Jesus. And so many of the stories in there, I'm like, wow, okay, I see what he was doing in my own life with some of the stories. I relate to his stories and how he tells them, especially because in the very beginning it talks about Young Life, and I was a Young Life kid in high school and lived for Young Life for many years. And then actually even in addition to Aid the Silent, I am on Young Life staff as like my side gig because I love it so much. But yeah, I would say Love Does really open me to, okay, love is an action. I'm just gonna do it. And it might not make sense to everybody, but I don't care anymore, you know? And just following what Jesus says and what the Holy Spirit is telling me had made my life so adventurous. Like, I've done things I never would have imagined because of being 100% all in when it's uncomfortable and when it's not fun. So that book has taught me probably a lot in the very beginning of my journey with Abe the Silent, was Love Does. I did read Passion and Purity by Elizabeth Elliot. I love that book, and honestly, I was single for a very long time, and I had to get to the place that, and this is, I guess, for young women listening who are single, I had to get to the place of, I am so content. I had that question in my heart of, if the Lord asked me to stay single my whole life, would I be content and satisfied? And I got to the place, yes, truly I was. I really was. My life was so full with people, ministry. I could literally just hop on the plane one time and I went to Iceland to be like a chaperone for some random group. Like, things like that were happening in my life because I was single, and now I have finally found my person. So it took a long time, but I truly was very content. Just Jesus and I and my teenage crowd that I hang with. So,
well, I got to spend a weekend with Bob Goff in a small event, sort of weekend, and one of the things that I noticed about him was he was all in with whoever he was talking to. Do you know those sort of people? It's such a gift. Like, they're just right there with you, and you're the most important person in the room because they're talking.
yes.
Like, they make you feel like, I see you and I care. And so,
Oh, yeah,
that
you can
gives,
tell
like,
the difference.
yeah, and
Yes.
that
when people aren't with you, you're like, I can see you kind of glazing over my head, you know.
yeah,
But he does have that gift. I've met him a few times. But he's someone that really impacted me early on, and then I had a manager for me who taught me something that is very similar to what Bob Goff has taught me. She said, whenever you're with a child, you always get down on their level. And you stop talking to the adults, you get on their level. And so, regardless if you were wearing like a ball gown or whatever, heels, I always ended up on the floor with children. And I feel like that has changed so much in my heart. And I talk to people is, I have to get on their level. And maybe it's not a physical like level of getting low with a child, but it's just being able to relate to people and kind of see them for who they are. And I feel like that book helped me so much of just, you got to be all in for people. And that changed my ministry. And, you know, I longed for that when I was young, with that relational connection. As a huge wound of mine. So I loved living out the part that I needed to see that relationship is so important. And as difficult as people are sometimes, it's just so important to be seen and known. And so I have to do that for people. And I hope that as followers of Jesus and women, that we are able to start being intentional and relational, because there is something so rich and deep about that.
yeah. If you could have coffee with any woman from history, and it could be somebody living still, that's okay too, who would it be?
That's good. Maybe Margaret Thatcher. She was really tough.
Yeah, she was.
Probably her. Or honestly, Elizabeth Elliot could be a big one as well. But women who were tough. I read a story about Harriet Tubman. Did I say her name?
Yeah.
Harriet Tubman. She was super tough. I read the story that she had like a piece of metal on her head for her whole life, and that she had it removed later in life. This piece of metal from like a slave owner, hit her in the head, and she refused anesthesia, like refused to go under for the surgery, and was like, you know what, I'm gonna bite on a bullet, because that's what soldiers would do in the war when they got like amputated limbs or something. They just bite on something like a bullet, and I was like, you know what? I want that spirit. So maybe her. 'Cause she just
I want to bite on a bullet.
very tough. Yeah, very tough. And she was rescuing people on the underground railroad. So I'm thinking, this is probably my lady. This is probably who I would have done battle with. For sure. Oh, I thought of my favorite book, actually. I forgot it. Oh, The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom.
Yes.
That, I changed my answer. That is who I would want. I know, I love that. I'm a history nerd, but Corrie ten Boom is probably who I would want to have coffee with because she forgave her enemies.
I know.
Like the SS officer came to her door and she somehow, through the grace of God, praying in that moment, was able to forgive him. And there's a lot of people that I would love for God to work on my own heart to forgive. But Corrie ten Boom was rescuing people and hiding them. And so I feel like if I was in that time era, that would have been my right-hand lady, for sure.
I love that.
Yeah, I love all the women you mentioned, and it's a tough question to pick one woman. So I'm glad you didn't pick one. You picked several, and that's okay.
Yes. I could talk forever.
Well,
so I spent so much of my life not talking, so it's hard for me. You're
just catching up, right?
Yes.
Well, Emma Faye, we're going to let you go, and we're so thankful you came on the podcast. But you mentioned James, and I was reading in James this afternoon, and as you've been talking, I was thinking of some of the verses I read just today, and then you brought up James, and I have to read. I don't know if this is the verse you were referring to, but in James 2:14, it says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed or lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warm and filled,' without giving them the things needed for their body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." And your life is an example of true faith being lived out in such a beautiful way. And so thank you. This afternoon was just a blessing to me. I know it was to Sarah, and I know it will be to our listeners as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much for letting me celebrate all that God has done. So thank you.